Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Perligo Ponders, in which I respond to your comments, questions, and theories related to my own comments, questions, and theories about the lore and music of 21 Pilots. As always, if you'd like your comment to be featured in the next episode, simply comment something interesting down below, a question you have or a theory you have. Feel free to flag it as a question for Perligo Ponders if you would like, so it catches my eye, but I don't exclusively pull comments with that tag. This first comment comes from Amer the Gamer Guy, who we've seen in these episodes before. I have another question, Perligo. Ponders, in both songs, Isle of Flightless Birds and One Way, they both talk about flying. In Isle of Flightless Birds, Tyler talks about how he wants to / will fly with no hope and no fear. He also talks about how he will plummet while singing. In One Way, Tyler talks about how he wanted to fly, but a system's coming in. Later in the song, he asks himself why he's still walking. Going back to Isle of Flightless Birds, Tyler does talk about how the demons and angels are flying while himself and others are walking. Do you think that these two songs have any sort of correlation with each other, or do you think that they're unrelated? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know that there are some people that think that One Way is just about the band flying on planes, which I do believe is one meaning of the song. However, I do believe there's more meaning to One Way than just flying in a plane. Once again, thank you for choosing my question. Keep up the good work. Happy New Year to you too. See, very recent comment. In answer to part of the second part of this, I don't think One Way is just about flying in planes. I think that'd be very strange if 21 Pilots wrote a song just about flying in planes and had nothing else going on. And I think it's also pretty easy to see that that's not what's going on here, given that we have seen time and again the imagery of flying throughout all their, many of their songs, not just Isle of Flightless Birds and One Way, but even a song like Levitate, which is pretty much entirely dedicated to the idea of levitation, at the very least. Fly by the dangerous bend symbols and overcompensate, and in the journal as well. Dreams of flying is also mentioned in the journal. There's this real theme and concept of flying. In fact, it's so prevalent throughout the lore and the story that I'm somewhat tempted to make a video dedicated entirely to it. Not because I have all the answers right now, but because I would want to spend the time finding the answers to make a video about it. Because I think it's a really interesting concept. The basic answer is yes, there of course is a connection between the flight in One Way and Isle of Flightless Birds. Because there's a connection, I think, between all the references to flight that we see. There's another interesting element to this that you touch on here, which is that, and I'm trying to find the exact quote, Tyler does talk about how the demons and angels are flying while himself and others are walking. And so I think the biggest visual connection that we see between the lore and Isle of Flightless Birds is that moment in the Paladin Street music video when we see the birds flying around overhead, the vultures, the surveillance vultures, watching them as they come in. And so we sort of have this vision of flying birds, which it's different to flightless birds, right? But it flight above us as there's climax to the story raging. And it sort of made me wonder if perhaps there's an implication here, and I'm not fully sold on this theory, but it's I think a possibility. Isle of Flightless Birds is being sung from the perspective of a Clancy in a previous cycle who is not climbing the tower and fighting, but that there is another fight going on in that tower over Dema. And those are the demons and angels flying around above them as they fight on the ground. Because if we look at the fight that takes place in city walls, Nico and Clancy are kind of flying around as they throw each other across the room. And so perhaps it's a bit of a stretch, I acknowledge that. Like I said, I'm not fully sold on this, but I do think it's an interesting visual connection between the representation of good and the representation of evil. Although you would probably arguably say the torchbearer is the more pure representation of good. Fair enough, but still like a representative of the good and the bad, fighting in that tower and flying around the tower as they fight. I do think it's an interesting connection, and whether or not that's specifically what's going on, it's yet another indication that imagery that we see in Isle of Flightless Birds is certainly similar to imagery that we see throughout the rest of the story, and vice versa. And so, yeah, I do think One Way is about more than just flying on planes. So on the other aspect, though, of One Way and flying, just kind of purely talking about flying and sort of what we see in One Way, the idea of flying to me seems to have an indication towards success or escape, maybe. Escape might be a more precise word. And so the success there is that he's always trying to escape. So if he does escape, he was successful in that attempt. And the reason I say that is because in Levitate and the Trench Saga, there seems to be a certain confidence that Clancy has that he's going to make it out, at least in the middle of the album, right? Or that at least that they'll win, right? Something like Nico and the Niners will win, but not everyone will get out. But there's a lot of sort of rebellion-fueled songs and letters there of we can do this. And that's a hope that sort of fades and wanes and comes back as the story goes on. But a song like Levitate kind of seems to indicate that I can escape, especially because that music video is him having escaped. He's in the Bandito camp. He knows how to levitate. He knows how to fly away from the things that are keeping him grounded in the dirt, in the graves of Dema. And then when you get a song like Overcompensate about flying by the dangerous bend symbol, it almost seems to imply that he escapes in such a reckless way that he doesn't heed the warnings of those who have escaped before, whether or not they're past versions of himself. And so he flies by, he escapes in a reckless way, and then there are consequences to that. And another aspect, bringing it back to one way, is wanting to fly, wanting to escape, but they said a system's coming in. I mean, what's the system that we hear about all the time in the story? The system of vialism, and sort of setting up flight against the system of vialism. Because there have been some theories in the past that flight is something to do with the bishops. Levitation is a power of the bishops and things like that. And I don't think it is. I think that is something that he's trying to do against the wishes of the bishops. And they, the system of vialism, stand opposed to flight. In a very, very simple surface level way, you could even see flight as just a trending towards an upwards direction, as opposed to trending towards a downwards direction to your grave, which is what the bishops and the system of vialism want them to do. In short, it was a bit of a convoluted answer, but in short, yes, I do think there's a connection, and I definitely think One Way is about more than just flying on planes. I definitely think there is probably a lore connection there, at the very least, something else significant going on. Next up, we have a comment from Krista with a K-21pilots. I was watching their collab with Roblox in that series, but specifically the Q&A. I noticed Josh, the torchbearer, said Clancy would be a good supervillain. This got me thinking, were they trying to hint to us very early on about what was going to happen, or is that just a coincidence? Do you think that they had the whole story planned out, except the little details, or do you think they added major plot points as the story went on? This is a very good question, and one which I don't know if we can ever properly answer. We have some indications from things that they've said that seem to lean one way or another. They've certainly have said things as late as 2024, the fall of 2024, that they were still working out the ending to the story, but then also that they've had an outline of the story mapped out since, right when Josh and Tyler started working together in the band. My inclination is to say this is probably just a joke that the torchbearer made, but at the same time acknowledge that there is a very good chance that they were hinting at something that was going to reveal Clancy to be a more sinister character than we originally thought. So it's a short answer, but it's a short question. I think that basically is about as much as we can really say right now. Obviously, if any of you know specific quotes that provide further information about this, let me know. But I think they've never really explicitly said when they started writing the story or when they finished writing the outline of the story, much less the details. From Circular Diamond, Perligo ponders, if this Clancy really did plan out his failure to break the cycle with the Torchbearer and Paladin Strait, this is, for context, a theory that I put out in my final theory before City Walls, so they could get the next Clancy farther. Is it possible the two try to involve Nico, possibly in the contract, when we see pleading to take the deal, in hopes to free him from his own cycle? Could this explain Clancy almost encouraging Nico to transfer his power to him when he was stabbed by wearing the red tape? Or is Nico's cycle and his eventual release separate from Clancy's attempts to be free from his cycle? Thanks for all the great content. Thank you for watching. Yes. Is it a possibility? Yes. Do I think it's likely? Not really. Yeah, not really. I don't know. The contract is still a song which I'm trying to wrestle with. I think there are a lot of different ways to fit that song into the story and the ending of the story that we got. Contract is a song which has always been hard for me to kind of place within the lore, because I think it's a little unclear what's going on there, and there's so many options. The Torchbearer was the one offering the contract. Well, the Torchbearer certainly was the one offering the coat, but at the same time, Clancy was the one singing, I plead, just take the deal. I think it's unlikely that they were talking to Nico. However, the caveat to that is, could this Nico also sort of know that he wasn't going to be able to be the one to break the cycle? He was going to have to become Nico, right? A past Clancy who became the Nico that we see in the story, became Nico, lost to himself, but was sort of helping in some way, or at the very least, if he couldn't help because he was so too far gone, something deep inside him wanted this next Clancy to succeed. There are moments which sort of seem to hint at this, and again, I'm probably reading too much into it, but at the same time, you could read this into it. Moments like at the end of Paladin Strait, which is then repeated in the contract and repeated in city walls and all of this. That moment where he grabs Clancy by the neck and says, "So few, so proud, so emotional. Hello, Clancy." There's almost a sadness in his tone and his eye as he says that, which if you want to read into it, could almost indicate that he, again, wanted this Clancy to succeed, to break the cycle, and sort of knew in that moment that he wasn't going to, and he was going to kill that Clancy. There's just a real tragedy all around at the end of the story. It isn't necessarily the case that Clancy and Nico conspired, they had this plan together, but sort of Nico knew that he was going to have to kill his Clancy for them to have any hope of breaking the cycle down the road, and that filled him with sadness, but it was what he had to do. And you almost get the sentiment at the end of City Walls, right after he stabbed Clancy, and then he goes and breaks the antlers. He doesn't look happy that he just defeated his enemy. He looks sad and heartbroken. That would be my answer. I don't think they ever met in person. I think there's a possibility that some way perhaps Nico deep down understood what was going on. We have a comment from Cosmo. For Perligo Ponders, I desperately wanted for Clancy to use the net horns to use the power of vialism. In my mind, he'd control trash and burn down Dema. Do you think they might have been heading in that direction but ultimately changed? Or if not, what do you think is wrong with that hypothetical ending? Would this have been really epic visually to see? Yes, 100%. Would it have taken a bigger budget than they had for Paladin Strait or City Walls to pull off? Not necessarily. I mean, maybe. I don't really understand all of the ins and outs of CGI budgets and things like that. But I think, they already were using some CGI. They'd already built the CGI model for trash and so on. I think it wouldn't have been impossible to do something like that. Just have a very quick flyby shot of trash swooping in and burning it. The main problem I see with that, though, is that Trash is dead at this point. And, he's dead before we see him in Saturday in the outside. However, in those instances, he's being seized. And from what I can remember, I don't think, unless you understand Clancy to be a rare exception, and that's a sort of other theory, but leaving Clancy aside, because he obviously is an exception anyway, I don't think we've ever seen a vessel seized more than once. And please do correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm misremembering something. But Keon's is seized once. The vessels in the live stream are seized once. All of these vessels are decaying as they are seized, and they start falling apart. Trash the Dragon is seized once. And so my thinking is you can't seize them again. So Clancy couldn't bring in Trash, even if he could somehow get that seized vessel to breathe fire, which maybe it could. I don't know. I don't think it would be possible to seize a vessel that's already been seized. I think that's the main issue with this hypothetical ending. Would it have been cool to see? Yeah. I mean, I think the ending we got was cool too. It really comes down to, did Clancy actually want to completely destroy Dema or not? Yeah, I think that's unfortunately the main issue with it. Because I remember when we saw the images of Dema burning before the Breach saga started, we were still just looking at the digital remains images. There was some speculation floating around that Trash might come in and make a return. I think that is one of many reasons why that didn't happen. Final question of Perligo Ponders. This question comes from a Spotify listener, ABACAXI, who writes, "Hi and Happy New Year. Just listened to all the episodes and I'm really happy I can understand it in the first place. So my first language is not English. That's awesome. Found everything really interesting. I have a question. In Nico and the Niners, they say we'll win, but not everyone will get out. Do you think this means they don't want to let the other people out of Dema? Because for me, it feels like they want the victory just to be for the banditos and not for everyone." Yeah, this is an interesting question. I mean, looking at that line from Nico and the Niners in the context of the ending that we got is worth doing. It's worth considering. I think, in short, no, that's not the implication there. And I think the line, "will win, but not everyone will get out," I think very much is either a hint at the ending or just kind of a sentiment that as they try to escape from Dema or overpower the bishops or break free of the system of vialism, not everyone who's here at the start of the rebellion is going to make it to the end, which is just a very realistic sentiment when you're rebelling against a system of government, I guess. But I don't think, and I think it's pretty clear from things that we see and little bits of the lore that perhaps you haven't had a chance to really dive into, and fair enough. The ending and the final push at the end to free Dema is not just for the banditos. In fact, if it were just for the banditos, there wouldn't be much reason to go back to Dema because the banditos are the ones who have already escaped from Dema, and Tyler's included in that. There was a time where they were trying to get Tyler out, but he gets out. He's free, and then in the I Am Clancy video, he says, "I'm returning to Dema." And he brings the banditos with him to free the citizens. And then we see letters like the little note that's attached to the back of the Dema crime report from Elliot saying, here's the plan, here's when we need to evacuate, and so on, or things like that, where There's definitely a line of communication between the banditos and the citizens in Dema who are friendly to the rebellion. We also see this in the letters throughout the Clancy tour. So I think it's pretty clear that there definitely is a drive from Tyler and the banditos and things like that to rescue as many people as possible, citizens or banditos, and really convert everyone who's a citizen to the way of the banditos and establish the real religion back in Dema as opposed to vialism. But that isn't accomplished at the end of the story that we get. So hopefully that answered your question. Hopefully that makes sense. And thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for listening despite the language barrier. I respect that. I don't think I'd be able to do that. Once again, if you would like your own comment or question to be featured in one of these episodes, just leave a comment down below. Feel free to flag it as Perligo Ponders if you would like, but I don't just pull from those comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. If you enjoy this, make sure to subscribe to the channel or follow on Spotify so you don't miss out on more music commentary and analysis.